Hi everyone, my name's Cureton, Senior Journalist for XR Today, and we're bringing you the latest and greatest from the XR, VR, and AR industry. Today we have on a very special guest. We have on Abishur Prakash, co-founder and futurist for the Center for Innovating the Future in Toronto, Canada, which is an advisory firm specializing in business and geopolitics. And we're here to discuss his latest book, The World is Vertical, and how it will apply to the global XR industry. So thanks for joining us today, Mr. Prakash. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me on. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. And so what we'll do, go ahead, tell us a little bit about your work with the CIF and what exactly it is that you do, because this is a very niche and very special kind of field that people are, exploring when it comes to emerging technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, as you mentioned, Center for Innovating the Future, where we're an advisory firm really focused on what's next for business and for geopolitics. And in 2013, I coined the expression next geopolitics to define how technologies like AI and robotics were going to transform geopolitics and what this would mean, whether it's for a business, whether it's for a country, whether it's for a city. And so we work really with senior executives, CEOs of organizations to help them navigate this new terrain of geopolitics and help them stay profitable, help them stay competitive. And in my capacity there as co-founder, I've also written 5 books on this next geopolitics, on this geopolitics of technology, including Next Geopolitics Volume 1 and 2 and Geopolitics of AI. And my latest book is The World is Vertical, and it's a story about how technology is actually causing the world to divide and split, which is counter to what many of us have believed, that technology will actually bring the world closer together and integrate the world deeper.
Excellent. And I'm looking forward to, delving further into that topic and discussion. It's something that, we've talked about in previous articles with other companies, and, it's a very fascinating subject that I think a lot of executives are in some ways struggling with because they're not really sure how the market is going to, materialize in the near future. So what we can do now,
But it's actually quite interesting if you look back from my own personal experience that in the past, there was a lot of me trying to get executives to think about these things because it wasn't a pressing issue, geopolitics of technology at least. But now it's the opposite. Now many executives come to me because they're seeing this every day, and it's really affecting their operations, their structure, their corporate strategies, which are created not on a quarter-to-quarter basis, but many of these corporate strategies are created for 3, 5, 10-year plans. And now the entire world is transforming because of geopolitics of technology, and they need to know what's next. They need assistance and support in dealing with these new challenges.
absolutely. And so what we'll do today, we're going to do just that. We're going to explore a lot of those different challenges, especially how they're related to the XR industry, which is also one of the most nascent, emerging technologies out, along with AI,
Right.
5G and others. So the first one, we'll go ahead and go into the first question. So in your book, you discuss key examples of a vertical world divided by geopolitical barriers, new strategic alliances, and the rejection of globalization. Can you explain that in further detail about how this applies to the tech industry in general? You just touched a little bit on that, but could you go a bit further
Sure,
into it?
sure. So let me spend a few moments kind of explaining what this vertical world concept is, just so that we have some kind of a definition. If you think back since the end of World War II, for the past 80 years now, or 70 plus years, the world has moved in a certain direction. There's been a certain design to the world, and that design has really been about bringing countries together, about getting rid of the barriers, the economic and social barriers that once existed in the world. It's about integrating economies. And if you think about countries as strings, countries have been, woven together over decades. And everybody is kind of plugged into the same systems and institutions. If you take the United Nations, for example, everybody's part of the UN. If you think about how countries connect their financial systems to one another, every country joins SWIFT. And on the back, and we've called this globalization. This is what we've meant when we've said the word globalization. And on the back of this, large multinationals have flourished. That their ability to access labor markets and consumers and build these super complicated supply chains completely depends on globalization. What I'm saying now, however, is that as all of this has taken place over the past 70 odd years, many countries have also been quite angry. They have felt that there has been a negative to this form of globalization, that really they've felt three issues. The first is that they're losing sovereignty. Second, they felt that they've become unable to compete economically. And third, they felt that their identity and culture have started to erode. Except if they felt that way, until recently, there was nothing you could do. If you did not like the current form of globalization, then you're isolated in the world, you're alone in the world. But with technology, countries are now almost fighting back. Countries are now establishing their own kind of new vertical borders. So instead of the world being open and accessible, as it has been for decades, now it's becoming full of these technology-based walls and barriers. So the world is vertical, and this is the new design of the world, and it's the new design of globalization. So I'm not saying so much that countries are walking away from globalization or that there's deglobalization taking place, because I know these words have become quite popular. But what I am saying is that a new form of globalization is now emerging. And that's what I call this vertical globalization. And probably the sector that will be hit the hardest is the technology sector, because the technology sector has operated a certain way for decades. If you think about the term big tech, all of these large technology companies have been able to transcend borders for decades. They've been able to go from Boston to Budapest to anywhere, and they've been able to take their product and their service into a market. If you take Uber, for example, Uber literally just opened up shop wherever it wanted to and took their service directly to people. And that angered a lot of governments. Now, in this vertical world, two challenges are emerging for big tech, though. The first is that countries are now forcing these large technology companies to rethink everything. So, for example, Russia has sent a notice that I believe it's 22 large technology companies must create a local Russian company, that they can't just operate from London in Russia. They have to have a local Russian company that hires local Russian people and complies with the Russian laws. So you can see that the ability of these technology companies to transcend borders is ending. But at the same time, there's a paradox, which I talk about in the book, which is at one moment, technology companies are not able to transcend borders anymore. But at another moment, they're kind of creating their own borders and territories. So if you look at all of the undersea cables that are being built now, connecting Asia and Africa with the West, it's all being built by technology companies like Facebook and Google. So this is this paradox that's taking place. And one of the big challenges beyond these two that I've laid out is that because the world is now dividing and splitting, the fates of technology companies are up in the air. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the big drivers of this vertical world is this US-China competition. And you can see now how it's affecting technology companies, because China doesn't want its technology stars to be dependent on American finance. So we saw what has happened with Didi. we're seeing now China's trying to get its technology companies to stop depending on American stock markets and instead list in Hong Kong or list in mainland China. So these fault lines are now emerging, and the world is fragmenting. And now you're seeing with SenseTime wanting to go list in Hong Kong, and the US has come out and said, we're going to sanction SenseTime. And this has completely hijacked the IPO. So technology companies are going to be affected and are already being affected because the geography of their industry, the geography of how consumers have operated, the geography of the global economy is essentially being redesigned from the ground up now.
Right. Yes. And there's loads of examples taking shape, especially with the US-China trade war, which continues
Right.
throughout different administrations, that we will only see what will take place in the near future, even though it does seem like some of the fears have been allayed over the past few weeks. We can only, hope that things continue in a positive direction, or at least in a reciprocal
Of course.
direction. We can talk about one of the examples that I wanted to cover regarding, one of the biggest buzzwords out there at the moment, which is the metaverse. And this has huge implications for the way we communicate in the near future. And people now are trying to devise standards for this platform. So one of the examples that we saw is that at a major event in September, there were several key advocates that called on the tech industry to build decentralized open metaverses. Now, why should the development of the metaverse follow these efforts to build the internet during its rise? And what will happen if an international standards protocol is not developed in favor of increased competition amongst tech rivals?
I looked at UNESCO that came out recently with that they've 193 members have signed an agreement to cooperate on AI ethics. And if you look at this agreement, it's not an agreement, it's more of a pledge that they'll work together in certain areas, but there's really no global AI ethics. So what I'm saying is that we are exiting the era where there were these single rules for everybody. And we're entering an era where there's no incentive for governments and countries and even companies from specific origins to cooperate with one another. That technology is allowing everybody to have some sort of independence and autonomy. And so the expression in the West right now that's becoming very popular is that we only want to work with like-minded nations. That's become a very popular expression. And it's a sign that the strategic thinking is changing. It's not that we want to work with everybody. We only want to work with like-minded nations. So if that's the new status quo, that the world is kind of splitting into these camps of countries, into tribes, then there cannot be any international standards for the metaverse. And anybody that tries to devise them is going to have a tough time bringing over countries like China, like India, countries outside of the Western world. And even within the Western world itself, we saw in September this AUKUS agreement that was announced, this massive defense alliance between the US, UK, and Australia that's completely split the Western world. And this is a defense alliance depending on technologies like AI and quantum and cyber. And we saw how France reacted. We saw that the Germans didn't even know about this. We saw that the Canadians were not even invited to this. So if that can happen in the Western world, if that kind of division can happen because of technology, then it can happen anywhere else. And so I think what we're going to see emerge with the metaverse as far as these standards go is that you're going to have regional rules. And you're going to have governments either supporting their companies or governments themselves trying to take their rules to the world, because every country, every region is going to have its own sphere of influence. I'll give you one example. Saudi Arabia has announced that starting in January 1, 2024, any company in the world that wants to do business with the Saudi government, including state-backed companies, must base their regional HQ in Saudi Arabia. So just think about that. You have now this government, Saudi Arabia is a rising power, and it's now saying, no, we're not going to necessarily do things the way things were done in the past, where we were open and we worked with other Arab nations. No, if you're a foreign business and you want to do business in Saudi Arabia, you got to be based your entire regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh. So if that's the start of the vertical world, then really these technologies like the metaverse are going to be utilized to enhance this way of thinking, this behavior. Countries are going to leap on these technologies, on these platforms, as a way to almost build up their footprint and influence in the world.
Absolutely. And, when we go through the kind of trove of different articles that come out every day, the different developments, it's just a deluge, and the updates happen at a moment's notice. We don't know exactly how they're going to turn out, but we can kind of gauge it using futurism to see exactly how they're going to develop. One such article that caught my attention was that in September, I think it was late September, Meta announced it would pledge 50 million to ethically build the metaverse. And it actually partnered with organizations such as the Organization for American States, the OAS, which is closely aligned with, I don't know if you want to call it hemispherism, or like at least a policy of like pro-Western ideals and values and so on. It also partnered with certain key universities in the United States, South Korea, and Singapore. Other organizations in Europe and Africa have also joined that initiative. So what does it say about the direction that companies such as Meta plan to go in when it decides to build the metaverse, after its major Connect event in October? And do you believe that this alliance will permit bilateral relations between spheres of influence, like China and the United States, as they build it, as they construct it?
Well, there's a few points here. I mean, the first is that in the vertical world, companies are now picking sides. If you talk to an executive, the companies, especially the big ones, they try and stay neutral as much as possible because it's not in their interest to pick sides. They're eyeing more access to consumers, more revenue. But now companies are picking sides. If you look at, for example, the recent exit from China of LinkedIn and Yahoo, it's a clear indicator that companies are accepting that, hey, certain markets have become off limits. You look at TikTok in India. TikTok's banned in India. So these global bridges that have connected the world and connected populations are starting to come down. And it's a very serious challenge. And so what Meta is doing is it's also picking sides by aligning with these countries and these organizations. It's a message that we are building this metaverse in alignment and in partnership with a certain ideology, with a certain cultural approach to these things. And it's a geopolitical signal, which goes to my second point, which is that large technology companies are as much able to drive geopolitics and drive world affairs as sovereign governments are. And you take, for example, SoftBank in Japan. Last year, the founder of SoftBank announced that he wants to build an AI connectivity corridor between Japan, India, and Southeast Asia. So just think about that now, that these fault lines, these technology-based fault lines are emerging. And for Japan, Japanese companies are some of the most globalized companies on earth. I mean, we've all grown up with Japanese brands. And so you have now one of the biggest, most iconic Japanese companies saying, no, we don't want to necessarily connect with the entire Indo-Pacific. We only want to connect with certain countries, specifically India and countries in Southeast Asia, which may not have been said by him, but in the background, there's definitely the concern of China, which is behind these kind of new initiatives. So large technology companies like Meta, whatever initiatives they undertake, like what they're doing with the Americas, with certain countries in Africa and Europe, definitely is going to have an impact on the vertical world and on geopolitics. As far as the relationship between the US and China, Well, right now, if you think about how technology is driving that relationship, because there's a lot of talk about, and there's this expression of tech Cold War, which to me is really just a strange expression because this is not a Cold War. The Soviet Union was never an economic threat to the United States. The Soviet Union was never on a path to overtake the US economically. China is. So this is not a Cold War in any regard. But if you think about another term, that this tech war, what is it really about right now? Really, it's about, okay, TikTok ran into some trouble in the US. Really, it's about, okay, Huawei's 5G is currently, kind of being pushed out of certain markets. But the real technologies haven't even begun to affect it yet. We haven't really seen, let's say, AI or quantum start to affect and drive this tech war. And so the same goes for the metaverse, that in the coming years, the metaverse is going to become a theme because of how it could be utilized. For instance, next year, China is preparing to unveil its digital currency, its digital yuan. And one of the probably most powerful ways it could launch that currency globally is through a metaverse or some form of it, or even just if you think about this, Apple launching its AR glasses, right? And this is a product that's going to be used by billions of people. Well, I'm very sure that just as Apple launches its AR glasses, so is a Chinese company. And how different ecosystems are integrated into these metaverses is going to have a big role. Just for example, take what kind of platforms might you be able to access or not access depending on whose metaverse you're in. So for instance, if you're using the Chinese metaverse or you're using the Chinese AR glasses, you might be incentivized to order from Didi, not Uber. You might be incentivized to use the Beidou navigation system, not necessarily the GPS from America. So it's going to have a massive impact. And the fact that it's not being discussed or even included in the discussions about technology regarding U.S.-China relations is a sign that it's kind of like a Wild West. That these countries will take their own approach to them, and that's only going to make tensions even worse.
Yeah, and that definitely goes back into the standards, protocols that they should create. I mean, at least with the internet, restrictions, blockages to other kinds of content was done at the national level, but other countries could access them because there's no platform yet.
Right.
To the metaverse. There's no protocol. There's no standard protocol to it. You could have one company develop most of the metaverse, and then other smaller groups, could have a disadvantage at getting their own content out. For people such as content creators, people doing training,
Right.
There's no telling how they'll be able to access information in the near future. So this is a concept that I definitely want to monitor as things develop, so that way we can, know exactly which direction they will build the metaverse in, and that other voices who call for a decentralized platform, I think that it would be, from what they have said, it would be advantageous to create it the same way the internet was created, with that decentralized platform, or at least the open platform.
Sure.
But yeah.
Sure, but the absolutely that would be the utopian goal. However, in reality, if you look at, for example, the United Kingdom has created an institution called D10, and this is made up of 10 democracies: the U.S., Japan, Australia, India, and they want to set the global rules for 5G, not the Western rules or the rules for the members, but the global rules for 5G. So if that's now the reality, and you have organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like the Eurasian Economic Union led by Russia, you have the EU saying, hey, we don't want to necessarily depend on the US or China or anyone else for our technologies. And you have now France saying recently that we want to have European sovereignty. So you're going to have these competing groups, either literal or more subtly, explicit or inexplicitly, competing around these technologies. And it's going to create a really big challenge. And another aspect to this entire metaverse is that it's not just countries and companies who are creating it, but it's cities. You have Seoul saying, we want to create our own metaverse. And so is this now going to lead to a fragmentation within countries as different cities have their own different metaverses, which adds a completely new dimension to the vertical world?
Right, absolutely. And I remember also we may have spoken a while back about the regional cooperative economic partnership, I think it was called, RCEP, which that involves,
Right.
I think it's the world's
Right.
largest cooperative agreement in history. I think valued at
Yeah.
26.2
Yeah.
trillion, if I'm not mistaken. It's going to be massive. And I don't know how the
Yeah.
metaverse is going to factor into that, but only time will tell. And that could change the rules as well. I want I
Right.
wanted to
Right.
touch on one thing. You did mention about a lot of the different supply chains with the U.S.-China trade war, and I noticed that there could be some discrepancies or contradictions between the rise of interest in developing the metaverse and a shortage in components because it's affecting all certain sectors, computers, mobiles, automotive industry, and so on. As this demand grows and it fuels the surge in these new types of products, these new types of emerging technologies, um, do you see that the metaverse will actually have the potential to be realized if they have a shortage of components? So we have the ideal side of it, the software component, the content creation, now could potentially become at a disadvantage due to a lack of semiconductors, chipsets, and other things affected by the trade war.
Well, let's start by looking at software. I mean, this really goes back to the vertical world, which is that the whole world for years now, including the world that you and I grew up in, we've kind of all used the same software. We've either used, maybe when we were smaller, we grew up on Microsoft operating systems, and now we might have transitioned to Mac OS operating systems, but so has the whole world. And now you're seeing China has launched its own OS. South Korea wants to create its own OS. India wants to create its own OS. I'm pretty sure in the next year or two, the Europeans are going to want to create their own OS. So in terms of software having some kind of common platform that the world uses, that's ending as well. And that's going to affect the metaverse. Now, as far as the shortage goes, we need to distinguish between a shortage caused by physical conditions, i.e., labor challenges or resources are in short supply. So the actual hardware can't be manufactured versus a shortage that's created because a country will not export certain technologies. And that is, again, policies that several countries have adopted when it comes to advanced tech, specifically in the defense field, but also in the consumer technologies and more frontier technologies like quantum. A lot of countries are refusing to export these technologies because they don't want to give away their competitive edge to their adversaries. And so, absolutely, this will affect the metaverse because right now, nobody fully understands, maybe except for you, Dimon, but nobody fully understands the multitude of applications that are going to emerge for the metaverse, things that many people haven't even thought of. And as the metaverse is rolled out in different countries and more people join it in different ways, then more products and services are going to emerge. And at the same time, if that's happening and governments are using the metaverse to achieve a geopolitical goal, then these two areas are definitely going to converge. And that could result in countries forcing you to use certain metaverse, countries not allowing certain metaverses to operate within their borders. Countries, even in my book, I talk not specifically regarding the metaverse, but I talk about a concept known as technological exclusivity, which is that hardware might be built to only work with specific software. That you might have a chip that's built that doesn't work with software from a specific country on purpose. And if that happens, if this exclusivity emerges within the technology space, then that's also going to create challenges for these companies involved in the metaverse.
Right, right. Excellent points. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add regarding, I guess, topics about the metaverse, VR, XR technologies, AR, just to kind of wrap up the conversation? Because it's been an excellent discussion so far, and I'm really, really excited about it.
Well, there's just one last point to make, which is that when we talk about the metaverse and how it's going to affect either the vertical world or geopolitics, because the vertical world is a holistic design of the world. Geopolitics is part of it, but so is culture, so is society, so is economy, so is so many different business as part of the vertical world. But if we want to talk specifically about geopolitics, when we talk about the metaverse right now, we always talk about it from an outside in. Oh, how will France regulate the metaverse? That's one aspect. It's very important. But we also should adopt an inside out approach, which is that how will behavior within the metaverse affect geopolitics? So you have, for instance, Barbados, I believe, announcing that they want to create an embassy in the metaverse. So now you're going to have diplomacy and countries building their relationships within the metaverse. And so that adds a completely different variable to the mix. And that's going to take how we assess global politics, how we think about geopolitics in a brand new direction.
Absolutely. Yeah, I even remember seeing information about Croatia jumping on the bandwagon, and I think that it's going to kind of become a major focal point for a lot of countries to join the metaverse. I guess due to the benefits that it creates, as well as the potential for economic development. So, looking forward to the future, as we say. But yeah, thanks so much. Thank you so much again for your insights. Once again, this has been Abishur Prakash. He is the co-founder and futurist at the Center for Innovating the Future. So many thanks for joining us, and all the best. Take care.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
And if you guys enjoyed today's conversation, please like, share, and subscribe to our content so that you can always be kept in the loop. Feel free to also spread the word on our conversations from XR Today with the XR News hashtag on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So this is Cureton once again from XR Today. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a good one. Cheers.